You made it here. So why does everything feel like it has slipped away? Carl Jung traced exactly why the closing of a spiritual awakening can feel like total collapse. He named it deflation. And what disappears within it is not what you believe it to be. Your entire world split open. The numbers on the clock spoke to you. Strangers seemed to carry messages meant only for you. Now the flame has gone still, and the silence carries the weight of something living that has been laid to rest. By the time this ends, you will know precisely what has passed away. You will understand why the synchronicities fell silent, and why that silence is not the universe turning its back on you. You will understand who you truly became through the awakening and why that version of yourself had to dissolve. You will understand the moment when the seeker is meant to finally rest, and why almost nobody allows it, because you are standing inside an ordinary Tuesday that feels like a burial ground, lying there with your eyes wide open, mourning something you were never given permission to mourn. And what you buried was never the awakening itself. It was the one who depended on the awakening to feel chosen. By the end, you will know whether this silence is your undoing or the first thing in years that has ever truly belonged to you. You keep anticipating the moment when you finally land somewhere solid, but this stillness is not a place you have arrived at. It is the sound of something within you that has ceased to breathe. You have already met a smaller echo of this. The morning that follows the wedding you spent an entire year arranging. The Monday after the journey you saved 2 years to take. That hollow, disorienting flatness that descends the day after you finally receive what you wanted. When the reaching stops and silence floods in to occupy the space desire once held, you expected to feel whole. Instead, you found yourself emptied. Now take that quiet disappointment and spread it across the entire architecture of who you believe yourself to be. That is the terrain beneath your feet right now. For years, your life was torn open in ways you could not put into words for anyone around you. The digits on the clock carried the feeling of intention. Every person you crossed paths with seemed to deliver the precise piece of understanding you needed at exactly the right instant. For the first time in your existence, you felt yourself becoming the person you were always meant to be. Your unremarkable days were charged with something, a current, a sense that something vast was moving through your life, rearranging it, pulling you awake. But lately that current has gone still. You are standing inside an ordinary Tuesday, and it feels nothing like awakening. It feels like the most significant thing that ever touched your life has been taken from you. And no one ever warned you that completion might resemble an empty, wind-swept plain. So you do what any person would do. You go in search of the fire. You reach for the books that once split you open, and they read like operating manuals for a machine you no longer possess. You wait for the signs to find their way back to you. You question whether you did something to break it, whether you allowed the awakening to pass through your hands unclaimed, whether the version of you that felt so fully alive, so chosen, so near to something real, has quietly departed and left you standing in a life that feels like a room someone already vacated. You have begun to suspect you imagined all of it. The doubt comes softly, mostly late at night when everything else has gone quiet. You trace your memory back to the months when each day carried the weight of revelation, and from where you stand now, in all this gray, those months look almost shameful, like reading the journal of someone you once were and can no longer quite place. You grieve that person. You grieve the one who rose before sunrise, absolutely certain the universe was speaking to them alone, the one who could not stop consuming knowledge, the one who felt the entire sky bending close to witness them. And you cannot settle on whether that person was nearer to the truth than you are now, or simply more removed from solid earth. What unsettles you most is that you cannot find a name for what you are carrying. It is not precisely sadness. Sadness has form, a target, a cause. This has none of those things. It is a blankness you cannot separate from numbness, a stillness you cannot distinguish from emptiness. You sit inside it and wait for it to crystallize into something familiar, and it never does. And within the silence, an ancient fear rises to the surface, that you poured years of your life into chasing something that was never there, that the magic was a narrative you constructed to endure a chapter of your life whose contours you can no longer recall. And this is where the true risk lives. Misinterpreting this silence will take everything from you. If you read this flatness as a regression, you will spend years in pursuit of the old current, engineering spiritual emergencies simply to feel conscious again. If you read it as defeat, you will deny yourself the grief, and you will lock yourself into the role of the perpetual seeker who can never, under any circumstances, arrive. You will hold the wound open deliberately, because the wound was the only thing that ever gave you the sensation of moving toward something. Jung did not approach this silence the way a mystic would. He approached it as a physician who had observed it unfold in his patients and then witnessed it unfold within himself. So before we move deeper into it, rest with a single possibility. What if this emptiness is not the awakening collapsing? What if it is the awakening completing its true purpose? We are going to move through 3 passages. First, what truly ended when the fire went still, because it is not what you believe you are mourning. Second, the precise Jungian mechanism that makes this ending feel like the loss of everything, the part Jung considered genuinely perilous. And third, the single thing Jung understood about what remains once the seeker is finally laid to rest, the one recognition that inverts this entire loss completely. If nothing else keeps you here, stay for the 3rd passage. It is the one that determines whether the remainder of your life is spent eulogizing the heights or standing on the ground those heights were always preparing for you. Remain in the discomfort of this. The naming ahead will be exact, and exactness is not always kind. You believe what you are mourning is the loss of your awakening. You are mistaken. What you are mourning is the death of the seeker. The seeker was the elevated, ravenous, extraordinary self you were required to become in order to endure the passage. Reflect on who you became during those years. You read until the light disappeared from the sky. You gathered understanding the way someone starving gathers food. You constructed an entire sense of self around unending inner work, around the community of those who were awake, around being the kind of person who could perceive what those still sleeping could not. The seeker was extraordinary. The seeker was also a survival structure dressed in sacred language. Jung held a precise clinical term for the condition you were inhabiting. He called it inflation. When the ego makes contact with the numinous material of the unconscious, the vast, ancient contents that exist beneath ordinary waking awareness, it does not merely witness them, it merges with them, it takes them in, it swells. Jung described inflation as the expansion of the personality past its rightful boundaries, an identification with an archetype or with the deeper psyche's contents that generates an inflated sense of one's own significance. In Jung's own words, it produces an arrogant attitude, a forfeiture of free will, and a fervor that moves through virtue and vice without distinction. Take that in slowly because it names something you have not permitted yourself to examine directly. The sense of being special that you carried during your awakening was not a higher vibration. It was the ego cloaked in sacred language. Something real was present. Something genuinely sacred passed through you. But the part of you that declared, "Look how far I have traveled. Look how clearly I can see. Look how chosen I am," That part was not awakening. That part was the oldest maneuver the ego has ever known. It wrapped itself in the vestments of the sacred and introduced itself as your soul. The ego confused the encounter with the self for the mastery of it. It positioned itself at the threshold of something immense and declared that it had constructed the entire dwelling. And notice how compelling that was. The awakening did not feel like inflation from within. From within, it felt like clarity. It felt like seeing for the first time after a lifetime of blindness. Every realization reinforced it. Every synchronicity reinforced it. Every exchange in which you grasped something the other person could not access reinforced it. The inflation constructed its own proof, because that is the nature of inflation. It conscripts the entire world to serve as its witness, and the more isolated and misunderstood you felt, the more it murmured that you had simply moved too far ahead for those around you to follow. You have almost certainly encountered the most visible version of this. The person at the center of every gathering who has consumed everything, who already holds a framework for your pain before you have completed describing it, who speaks about their own awakening in the measured, unhurried tone of someone relaying observations from a superior vantage point. Everyone yields to them. They are not dishonest. They have genuinely witnessed something real. But if you observe them long enough, you begin to notice they can no longer participate in an ordinary exchange. Every conversation becomes a lesson they are delivering. Every pause becomes wisdom they are quietly offering you. That is inflation with a human face. And the reason it is nearly impossible to detect in yourself is that from within, it does not register as ego. From within, it registers as depth. Here's what truly hurts. The community of the awakened, the people who shared the vocabulary, the sense of being part of something uncommon, much of that belonging was built upon a collective inflation, a mutual arrangement to affirm each other's distinction. The comfort it provided was genuine, but it rested its weight on a wound rather than on solid earth. This is the unsettling truth resting at the heart of your mourning. The intensity you long for so deeply was, in large measure, a psyche in the grip of crisis. The charge, the urgency, the conviction that everything carried immense weight. That is the signature of a self under tremendous pressure, a self being restructured, a self that had not yet located its foundation. The version of you that you are grieving was not your highest expression. It was a symptom, a beautiful, essential, temporary symptom of a transformation that had not yet reached its conclusion. And this reframes what the grief truly is. You are not standing at the grave of the magic. You are standing at the grave of the one who required the magic. You did not lose the light. You ceased being the kind of wound that confuses its own bleeding with luminance. Rest in that for a moment, because it is a difficult thing to receive. The aliveness you are longing to return to carried a price you were not tracking. It cost you stillness. It cost you the capacity to simply occupy a room without searching it for meaning. It cost you the ordinary. And you labeled the ordinary as unconsciousness, because the seeker could not endure a world that was not in perpetual confirmation of its own significance. But if the seeker was inflation, then what follows is the part Jung considered truly perilous, the part that almost no one passes through without sustaining damage. It is a Tuesday afternoon. You glance at the clock and see 3:33. A year ago, those digits would have poured a wave of confirmation through your chest, a signal, a knowing glance from the universe, evidence you were exactly where you needed to be. Today, it is simply the time. You press play on the music that once broke your soul wide open. And it is just sound moving through a room while you fold laundry. The signs have ceased to feel like signs. The world that was once dense with meaning, where every small thing gestured toward something larger, has gone absolutely still. The connections you built upon shared seeking have drifted apart, leaving behind a weighty, settled solitude you do not yet know how to carry. You wonder if you constructed all of it. You wonder if you slipped back into sleep. You did not slip back into sleep. Something of far greater consequence took place, and Jung named it with precision. This is the necessary deflation. Jung taught that the descent must follow the ascent, that this is among the most fundamental laws governing the inner life. He found it in Heraclitus, who named it enantiodromia, the principle of running contrariwise, the law by which all things eventually turn into their opposites. An extreme lopsidedness within the psyche cannot be sustained. The vertiginous heights, the charged synchronicities, the unceasing electric significance, all of it was compelled to turn into its contrary. It had to resolve into a flat, unspectacular plane. This reversal is not a sentence. It is not a regression into unconsciousness. It is the correction. It is the psyche restoring its equilibrium, drawing the expanded self back down from the rarefied altitude where nothing genuine can take root, and pressing it into the only ground in which a real life can be grown, the earth itself. And here is the mechanism that explains the silence of the world. Jung wrote that the highest purpose of inner work is conscious realization, and that the essential first step is becoming aware of those contents which have until now been cast outward. Projection, that is the operative word. When the psyche is overfull with unintegrated material, it projects its own interior onto the exterior world and then receives those projections back as external messages. The wound within you required the universe to speak, and so the universe spoke. The crisis within you required the clock to confirm that you were chosen, and so the clock confirmed it. The synchronicities were genuine experiences, but the force animating them was your own unconscious, pressing its contents onto every available surface because it had no other place yet to contain them. So, when the world fell silent, it did not desert you. You simply ceased projecting your interior crisis onto it. The synchronicities did not cease because you fell back into unconsciousness. They ceased because you no longer required the universe to murmur that everything would be well. The meaning receded back into its origin, back into you. The world is no less alive than it ever was. You are simply no longer nourishing it from the place of a wound. Allow yourself to feel how strange this loss truly is, because it is a loss, even when it is the correct one. For years, the world responded to you. The clock responded. The song responded. The stranger standing beside you responded with precisely the words you were desperate to receive. To inhabit a world that speaks to you without ceasing is to never truly be alone, even inside your deepest isolation. And now that voice has gone quiet, and the quiet carries the feeling of abandonment, even though nothing has abandoned you. You have simply stopped hearing your own unconscious return to you through the surfaces and objects of the world. Before we continue, there is something I want to ask you, because I read every response that comes in. This silence has already claimed something from you, a synchronicity you find yourself missing, a certainty you once carried without effort, a version of yourself you can no longer locate. Name that one thing below, simply the single thing you have not yet been able to speak aloud to anyone. Putting it into words is where the mourning quietly takes its first breath. Then remain here with me, because this silence is about to claim something more intimate than the synchronicities, and then it is going to ask you to make a choice. The friendships fall silent in the same manner. The ones constructed upon shared searching, upon the mutual charge of the journey, dissolve almost without being noticed. There is no confrontation, no fracture. There is simply less and less to offer each other. The conversations that once felt like sacred exchange now feel like a language you once spoke fluently and have begun, slowly, to lose. You are not above those people. You have simply stepped out of the shared fever, and you cannot pretend the fever still burns. What remains is a grounded, weighty solitude that you do not yet know how to interpret. It carries the feeling of a sentence being served. Jung would tell you it is the necessary condition from which everything genuine that comes next must emerge, and you have said nothing to anyone. That is what isolates you most deeply. Not the silence itself, but the impossibility of admitting aloud that you are mourning your own healing. Because every voice in the spiritual community insists that arriving is supposed to resemble joy. So you hold it inside, half persuaded that there is something broken in you for mourning the very thing you once pleaded to receive. Receive this clearly, because almost no one will offer it to you. You are not the only one standing in precisely this silence. You are simply among the rare few honest enough to name it as grief rather than performing it as peace. Jung encountered this silence from the inside. After his break from Freud and his departure from the academic world that had given him his identity, he moved through years of deep isolation. He wrote that the consequence of his decision was an acute loneliness. He carried thoughts that could be shared with no one, thoughts that would only have been met with incomprehension. He described experiencing the divide between the outer world and the inner landscape of images in its sharpest, most agonizing form. This was not a passing moment in his biography. This was the architect of the unconscious, giving precise language to the flat, unglamorous, solitary terrain you are inhabiting right now. He did not call it failure. He stood inside the gap, and it was within that gap that the true work found its beginning. This is the threshold that divides people into two entirely different kinds of life. And which path you take has nothing to do with how awake you became. It has everything to do with what you choose to do inside this silence. What do you do when the ongoing project of transforming yourself suddenly runs out of raw material? That is the genuine question at this juncture. For years there was boundless work before you, shadows to bring into consciousness, wounds to tend, patterns to dismantle, higher expressions of self to reach toward. And then one day, the material begins to thin, the deflation settles in, and you find yourself at a crossroads that will shape the remainder of your inner life. One road refuses the deflation outright. On this road, you hold fast to the seeker. You engineer the next crisis, the next revelation, the next dark night, the next level to ascend to. You remain perpetually in motion. You become a person who is forever in the process of awakening, because the alternative, arriving, is something you cannot bear. Arriving means the distinction ends. Arriving means you are simply a person moving through an ordinary life, like everyone you once privately believed you had left behind. Jung held a name for what ensnares you on this road. He called it the mana personality. When the ego declines to deflate, it commandeers the energy of the transformation and drapes it over itself like a permanent garment. It becomes the one who knows, the one who has witnessed. The spiritual identity solidifies into a mask that can never be removed because the person concealed beneath it is terrified of who they might be in its absence. Perpetual seeking is the most refined form of avoidance in existence. The person who is forever in the midst of awakening is not more profound than the person who came to rest. They are more frightened. They have discovered how to transform their terror of ordinary existence into the appearance of devotion. They have converted the act of fleeing from arrival into a spiritual accomplishment. And the mask is a comfortable one. That is precisely what makes it so treacherous. The mana personality is affirmed everywhere it travels. People yield to the one who possesses knowledge. They come seeking direction. They validate the distinctiveness in the same manner the synchronicities once did. And so the inflated self is nourished endlessly by an audience that mistakes its costume for genuine depth. There is always another teaching to absorb, another approach to pursue, another tier to ascend, another dark night to enact. And every single one of them delays the one thing the psyche is truly requesting: to descend, to be unremarkable, to stop. Consider the friend who has stood on the threshold of a breakthrough for 9 consecutive years. Last spring it was breathwork. Before that, a teacher in a foreign country. Before that, the silent retreats, the body-centered practices, the plant medicine ceremonies, the new approach to eating that somehow became a spiritual philosophy. Every few months there is a fresh doorway, a fresh almost there, a fresh vocabulary layered over the same underlying restlessness. You love them deeply, and somewhere beneath that love lives a question you have never spoken aloud. At what point does the searching stop being the road they are walking and become, quietly, the dwelling they have chosen to inhabit? You have never posed the question to them because lately, inside the quiet of your own unremarkable Tuesdays, you have begun to ask it of yourself. You can identify this crossroads in your own interior. Voice. Listen for the one that says, "You have not yet arrived. You remain on the journey. There is still more to open. The work does not end." Sometimes that voice is speaking truth, and sometimes it is the seeker, terrified, unwilling to allow the deflation to settle. Because if the journey were to conclude, it would be forced to confront the plain and unspectacular truth of being a human being like any other. In a life like any other, carrying no privileged vantage and no appointed cosmic purpose, the seeker would rather remain wounded indefinitely than concede that the wound has healed, because the wound was the sole thing that ever allowed it to feel appointed. The other road chooses honest grief. On this road, you allow the seeker to die. You mourn the dissolution of the specialness fully and without turning away. You acknowledge that you miss the sensation of being chosen. You acknowledge that the ordinary unsettles you. You allow yourself to feel the genuine loss of watching the most luminous years of your life recede into the distance. And you do not reach for the shovel to dig it back up. You allow what has been buried to remain in the ground. This is the more demanding road, and there is a reason for that, and it has nothing to do with the strength of your will. Jung understood that releasing the inflated self requires the ego to relinquish its claim to the center of all things. It requires accepting that you are not the protagonist of a cosmic narrative. It requires allowing yourself to be small, and the ego will resist that with the full force of everything it possesses. Because to the ego, smallness registers as annihilation, so it keeps one hand perpetually resting on the old wound, unwilling to release it. Because an open wound still points towards something, still implies a direction, still insists that you are owed a passage back to the heights. The perpetual seeker is not grieving. The perpetual seeker is negotiating, and the currency being exchanged is the years that remain to you. The honest grief demands something the inflation never required of you. It asks you to be a human being, unremarkable, unchosen, and genuine. Picture yourself finally lowering a heavy burden you fastened to your back the day the awakening began, and have never once removed. The relief is not triumphant. It is soundless. Your shoulders lift without the load, and for a moment your hands have no idea what to do with the absence of weight. What survives the deflation is not a transcendent self. It is smaller, quieter, and for the first time in years, it is not enacting its own profundity. It is not surveying the room for signals. It is not composing the story of its own becoming. It is simply present. Inside an ordinary life, being a person who has ceased to require extraordinariness. Jung would tell you this was always where the path was leading. The aim of individuation, the long labor of becoming whole, was never a sustained elevation. It was never the synchronicities or the current or the sensation of being chosen. It was the gradual shifting of the psyche's center of gravity away from the ego and toward the self. The self is the genuine center, the one that encompasses the unconscious, the one that requires no audience or signs or affirmation to affirm its own existence. As Jung understood it, the self does not simply rise into consciousness on its own. It is something we come to know gradually, through the unhurried descent into our own interior and the long journey back to the surface. The ego's deflation is what creates the space for the self to occupy its rightful and quiet position. The one who was always searching had to step aside so that the one who simply exists could finally take its place at the center. This is not a lesser reward. This is the thing the entire awakening was in service of. So take this in clearly. You did not lose everything. You lost the one who required everything. The ordinary life you are standing within right now, the one that feels so level, so unremarkable, so still, is the precise terrain the awakening was excavating and clearing from the very beginning. The signs went silent so that you might finally hear something softer moving beneath them. The fire extinguished itself so that you could at last feel the warmth of something that requires no burning, and so that you might begin to notice what only becomes visible now. With the seeker departed, you can love another person without converting them into a lesson. You can inhabit a room without assessing it for meaning. You can wash the dishes and allow it to simply be the washing of dishes. The relentless translation has ended. The tireless transformation of every passing moment into a symbol, a teaching, or a milestone along the path. What remains is contact, direct, unadorned, unmediated contact with your own actual life. The life the seeker was always too occupied interpreting to ever truly inhabit. Jung did not offer you the promise of a perpetual elevation beyond individuation. He offered something the inflated self was never capable of holding. A center that does not shift. When the applause of the room falls quiet, what passes away at the close of an awakening is the part of you that was in the act of awakening. What remains does not radiate, it simply, at last, remains. This quiet was never the failure you mistook it for. It is the sound of the one who could not see searching finally coming to rest. That stillness is not death. It is the first thing in years that is genuinely, entirely yours. Because it is not borrowed from a sign or a synchronicity or the seductive assurance that you were further along than everyone around you. You moved through the awakening convinced that the meaning lay out there somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. The deflation delivered the truth the seeker was never able to receive. The meaning was never out there, it was the thing doing the searching. And it has finally returned home and settled into an ordinary life on an ordinary evening and declared that this is enough. If a grief you were never given permission to feel just moved through you as you listened, share it below. What did you release at the end of your awakening that no one ever allowed you to mourn?